Welcome back to The Heat. We're talking about sexual assaults on U.S. college campuses. Some studies estimate almost 14% of female undergraduate students will be sexually assaulted while attending school. Joining me now is Angela Amar, a professor and researcher at Emory University in Atlanta. And with us here in the studio is Caroline Kitchens, a senior research associate at the American Enterprise Institute here in Washington. Thanks to both of you for being with us. Professor Amar, let me start with you. You've done research on both sides of this crisis, on the side of the survivors as well as the perpetrators. It seems that alcohol plays a big role in this. One of the figures I looked at, 17% of men admit to using alcohol to get women into bed. What did your research tell you?
Research confirms just what you said, that alcohol is a huge factor on both parties. Alcohol on the part used by women, alcohol used by men, and that oftentimes we find that men deliberately ply women with alcohol, give multiple drinks in an attempt to decrease resistance so that they aren't able to say no. What they often don't realize is that the absence of no doesn't indicate yes, and that once you've done this, you've crossed the line where consent wasn't obtained, and that is forced sex, sexual assault.
Caroline, how serious is the problem? Are these figures giving us a true picture of what is happening on college campuses and universities? I mean, is it being exaggerated? Is it being underreported? What is the picture?
Well, let's be clear. Sexual assault on college campuses is obviously a very serious problem. You just heard from two very brave women who were seriously harmed through their experience, and it is a serious problem. However, the statistics measuring sexual assault are often presented in a way that is very misleading and very flawed. You often hear that 1 in 5 women will be victims of rape while in college. But when you look at the source for this study, it's a 2005 study commissioned by the National Institute of Justice, and it used such a broad and expansive definition of sexual assault that anything from attempted forced kissing to a sexual encounter when someone has just had a few drinks, any of those things could qualify as sexual assault. So sexual assault is very difficult to measure. There are a lot of studies that give you completely different pictures. It is a problem, but the 1 in 5 figure may not tell the real story.
All right, let's get to Professor Amar's response to that. Is this problem being exaggerated, Professor Amar?
I don't think it's exaggerated at all. I agree that there were flaws, and as are in much research, but that when you look at experiences of being forced to have sex with someone when you didn't want to or when you were unable to consent due to drugs or alcohol, many times the numbers are higher. People don't report. People rape, we know, is the most underreported crime. And most women on college campuses, most men include, and men also, because men are also sexually assaulted, because of the rape culture that exists, because of the way it's handled, because of the way society perceives sexual assault and rape, don't come forward, don't always label it as such, even though it is that.
Isn't that the problem we have here, Caroline? That given the nature of this crime, it's probably underreported, given those reasons that the professor just put to us, because a lot of people just don't want to report this.
Absolutely. It's well documented that rape is a very underreported crime, which is why surveys such as the one that yielded the 1 in 5 estimate account for that. And when you actually look at official crime statistics, you can multiply them by 5, by 10, even 100 to account for the fact that the majority of rapes, some research says about 60 to 90%, are unreported. You can multiply them to account for that, but you still get nowhere near the 1 in 5 estimate. That would be astronomically high. That would mean that U.S. college campuses have rates of sexual violence that are higher than the war-torn Congo.
Professor Amar, what is it about life at universities that gives men the feeling that they can perpetrate these crimes? I mean, is there a feeling, well, A, of impunity, and B, that they're adults now, sex is part of it, this is what it's all about on campus?
Well, I think it's bigger. I mean, I feel like we all as individuals as well as a society sort of approach this with this set of beliefs that we have about what is sexual assault and what is rape. And for most of that, it means the stranger who jumps out of the bushes, who breaks into your kitchen, the unknown. And we have this whole thing of, you know, you're supposed to fight and your life's in danger. And we've sort of constructed this image of what is sexual assault. When you look at college campuses, it's someone you know, it's the person who's in your chemistry class, who's friends with friends of yours, who hangs out with you. It's also not a scary person. alcohols. I mean, there's all these other factors that don't necessarily resonate with the societal picture of what we see as, or how we define rape. And that complicates things because it doesn't make then young men or young women who sexually assault someone feel that what they're doing is rape, because they're not jumping out of a bush with a weapon and all this other stuff. But it also makes survivors then question whether or not this experience happened to them. And they often, which is often why it takes so long also to come forward to talk about it, because you've got to sort of resonate or let it connect what happened to you with the way we perceive this.
Right, and that brings me, Caroline, to something that you've written about, and that is something you've called rape culture on campus. What is that?
Sure. Rape culture is a term used by activists. It's been used by feminists since at least the 70s or 80s. And it's the idea that our entire culture, that rape exists because our culture allows it, because it normalizes it, and that rape could end if we attack these cultural factors and teach men not to rape. I agree, there are some cultural elements that are barriers to addressing sexual violence, but overall, I think the rape culture theory puts the focus on the wrong things. It causes people to target innocuous aspects of society rather than, I mean, make no mistake, the people responsible for rapes are the few people who choose to commit the violent crime of rape. It's not the average guy who likes ogling women in the Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition. It's not Robin Thicke for singing I Know You Want It, but it is men who have, for their whole lives, they know that rape is wrong. They've been told rape is wrong, but for whatever reasons, they haven't absorbed these messages. So I think that the rape culture narrative, it can trivialize the experience of survivors, and it causes us to deflect blame from the rapists who are truly responsible for the violent crime.
Right, Professor Amar, is there a certain type of individual that perpetrates these kinds of crimes, that preys on young girls? I mean, for instance, we heard from our two earlier guests in the first part of the show that there are serial offenders, that the average number of attacks perpetrated by one perpetrator is 6.
Right. And there is data to confirm that most of this, a small percentage of men who are actually rapists, and of those men, it is a very, most of them then go on to be serial rapists, commit multiple offenses, and that it's a very intentional act. It's selecting carefully of who would be the target. There's effort into then making that person the target. And is a much more intentional act than the misunderstanding sort of theory that we like to think about.
To what extent do university administrations aggravate this problem? Because, you know, earlier on when we talked with one of the young guests here, she was talking to us about Title IX, which is a reporting mechanism at university campuses. But we know that this particular law calls for a campus coordinator, someone that'll make sure that this is being implemented. 10% of universities don't have that. 46% of universities in the country, they've not even conducted any kind of investigation into sexual violence.
Well, schools are actually placed in a very difficult, I would say impossible position with regards to Title IX because of U.S. Department of Education guidelines. So in 2011, the Department of Education warned schools that they must aggressively target sexual assault offenders. And as a result of that, schools have responded. We have schools across the country are using their conduct boards to adjudicate and investigate essentially felony offenses. They are responding. They are hiring Title IX coordinators. But the simple fact of the matter is they're just tasked with an impossible task. They don't have the capabilities to investigate one of the most serious crimes known to man, and they are trying.
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. I often think about how difficult it is in our criminal justice system to adjudicate these cases, and yet we have our college campuses doing that very thing, and people bring in their own sets of beliefs, biases about what constitutes sexual assault, what constitute rape, and also given the fact that we're talking about their own students, and you're asking people to sort of say, one of our students, a future leader, a smart, bright, talented individual, is also a rapist, and that's a really difficult place. And so I think schools have a really tough time with sort of balancing the needs of survivors, this want to sort of protect young men, as well as then protecting the safety of the campus. And it's a really hard balancing act for them to do.
Right, but also, you know, it's the attitude of university administrations. As we heard the same guest earlier on tell us that in many instances, universities see this not as a criminal problem, but as a public relations problem.
I agree. I think schools see it as a public relations, but I also think that they also just feel that they do have this obligation for public safety. But I think that it's really hard for them to wrap their head around this idea of a student as a rapist, student as clinical, as criminal. What they're actually doing is saying, did you violate the behavior code that we have? So all students have some rules about what is the behavior supposed to be of a student on our campus. And what they're looking at in that then isn't a criminal offense as much as it is a behavioral offense. But the same biases, beliefs that we as a society hold that sort of says this is supposed to be a stranger thing, this is a misunderstanding, they couldn't have meant, what did she do, what did she wear, all this other stuff that sort of blames the victims still resides in the mindset beliefs of people who comprise administrators as well.
Right, Caroline, you wanted to say.
Right. I agree with the professor that schools just have too much of a conflict of interest in these cases to be expected to effectively adjudicate and investigate sexual assault cases. And you heard earlier about 2 women who the schools really failed them in that regard, but that's also happening with men. And that's the problem, because somehow it's become not only acceptable, but commonplace for victims to go to their universities rather than to the criminal justice system in order to bring justice to what happened to them. But that should be a problem for everyone. It fails survivors. It also fails people who are falsely accused. And the real question is, if somebody is found responsible for rape by a university court, the worst punishment at their disposal is expulsion. The person is still free. They could go to another campus. They're still free in society to rape again. And as we've heard, most rapists are serial offenders. So we need to focus on a return to the criminal justice system to give these rapists the time that they deserve and to remove them as a danger to society.
Right. It is, after all, a very violent crime. Caroline Kitchens, Professor Angela Amar, thanks to both of you for joining us. That's it for today's show. Beginning tomorrow, we'll have the latest coverage from the United Nations General Assembly in New York City. Please tweet us at cctv_America with your comments and story ideas, or join the conversation on Facebook with CCTV America. We'll see you next time. Thanks for being with us.